the exact going live at the top of the hour here. We have a little bit of wiggle room there. And even though it says live here, we aren't really streaming to the audience yet. We're just getting ready to go live.
Are we able to work in a bathroom break before we begin or not? You got time?
Well, if you need to do that, you should probably do that. But if you don't, then it would be better to stay here. It kind of.
I'll stay here. I'll ask the cat to get away from me.
And then, Stephen, if you have to duck out in the middle of it, I can make sure the camera's not on you. So I have a couple other things I just want to go over while we have a minute. One is that sometimes you all have headsets in, which is very helpful for sound purposes. But sometimes there's a little bit of audio interference just because of the delay of a signal. So when that happens, I will have to mute you, or you may have to mute yourself when you're not talking. So I want to show everyone where this mute button is. If you take your cursor up to the top of the screen, there's at the very top of the Google Hangout image, there is a microphone with a slash on it. And can everyone just press that on and off? So when it's red, you're muted. So I see Katrina has done it. Yeah. Yep.
Well, I don't see the microphone icon.
Okay.
I see a red dot. How would that do?
It's a microphone symbol with a slash through it. And if you drag your cursor to the top of the Google Hangout window,
yeah, right there.
It will appear.
I do not see it. Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, the Google blah blahs hangouts up on my left, right?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
First of all, my eyes are bad. I don't see anything. Looks like a microphone.
There should be a group of several white icons at the top of the screen.
No, I have none of that.
Oh, here's Mary. Let's just.
Steve, it's at the top. You have to see it.
Mary.
That's helpful.
That's okay.
Stephen, you have to drag your cursor to the top of the screen to see it.
What do you mean by the top of the screen? All the way to
yeah.
I see Google Hangout there, and I see a red dot with an X next to it. Is that the mute button?
Yeah, you know what, Stephen, I think we're going to be fine with you and your headset. We don't need to mute you out. So
okay.
Let's just not worry about that right now.
I just won't say anything. And then you
you say exactly what you want to say, but we're fine with you with the headset. Mary, we just need to make sure we got Mary. Mary, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Not wonderfully, but I can hear you.
Okay, can you keep talking to us a little bit? We just want to make sure we can hear you fine. We are hearing you. Keep talking, Mary.
Okay, the sound doesn't seem very consistent, but it's basically okay, so I can understand enough.
Yeah.
How does this sound?
Yes.
It's fluctuating a bit, but I think it's probably okay.
Okay, that's good. So you're good. Just stay where you are at what you're doing there. Here's what I'm just going to say.
Okay.
So you have a headset on, so that's good. Although David was just talking about the muting. If you have trouble muting, as Stephen, don't worry about it. We'll work around it. And I will say one thing. We got just technically there's a few minutes to go here. We are having trouble for whatever reason. Richard is having trouble coming on, but we are in contact with him. And he may well enter in the conversation a little bit later. And if he does so, the audience will not see this. What you're seeing here, everyone, is not what the audience is seeing. David is actually doing a live switch, just like a television live switch, and he's only sending out usually one image of somebody, not the bottom row there. So when you enter or come back in the bottom row there, don't worry about it because that's not going out to the audience necessarily. The other thing about it is if Google is not worried about your experience of the thing, so if you see some glitches or you're not seeing someone as clearly as you'd like to, don't worry about it. Google is trying to get your voice out first, your image out second, and it's trying to get it to the audience. It's the main issue with it. It's not really as concerned about what you're seeing, so don't worry too much about that. In that respect, just look in the camera as best you can, as I'm looking here when you're speaking, and pretty much just have a conversation. You do it around a roundtable in a cable television show or something like that. David, do you want to give a last any last tech kind of thing? I'll give a quick.
Yeah, that's my sort of last note. I just want to reiterate that because it's really hard to do. But you know, this sort of what you're saying, and even your listening makes more of an impact with the viewer if you are cognizant of where the camera is. So oftentimes the tendency is to always look at the other person's video, or even to look down. You can see if I'm looking down, you're going to get the top of my head on the camera. So just be very cognizant of where that camera is, and if you're able to look at it and continue your train of thought, that really, it makes it seem like you're actually talking straight to the other person.
Well, let me ask you a question, that connection. Is our target for our look, the green dot atop our computer, is that the camera? Or do we look at the screen like I'm looking at you now?
Your camera, where it would be ideal for you to look, and it's hard to do, is probably that green dot. If you go ahead and put your finger on that green dot, just so I can see where it is. Yep, that's the camera right there.
But if I look at you, that's not as good, correct? I should avert my eyes upwards.
If you can do that, it's helpful, but it's a very hard thing to do. So it's no one gets it right 100% of the time.
All right. So I tell you what, we're really at the time where we should go live here, and although we're missing Richard, he may well come on, and Katrina, we will just adjust accordingly. If he comes in, we'll just blend him into the conversation. I've talked to Katrina quite a little bit about the flow here. The basic thing is, in a minute or two here, I'm just going to go live. I will introduce the whole situation, and then we're going to go around. I will introduce Katrina. And then I'm going to basically go around the table, and each of you, I'm going to say one line of your name and your title, and then give you about a minute or so to explain a little bit of your background involved with, particularly on the topic at hand. What do you bring to the table based on this topic? A little bit on your background and what your interests are in Russia. We'll go back to Katrina. She will essentially do a little framing to start the conversation. And then she, and also me, will help kind of nudge, keep the conversation going. But mostly it's just a conversation just like anyone else you do. She will drive it, ask, and we hope that you'll also add your own insights into this, not just the pure moderator. We have it broken into 3 kind of sections. Generally, we don't have to worry too hard about that in terms of firms in and out. And we do like to kind of keep it wrapped up by the end of the 90 minutes, although right now we're starting a little bit later, but that's fine. It's not a hard out like broadcast, though, so we have a little bit of wiggle room there. And so Katrina's going to walk us through several different areas, and we'll just spontaneously we'll roll with where the conversation's going. And at the end of the whole session of 90 minutes, I'll flag you in that little chat box that we talked about there. Keep you up to date on time and really things like that. And by the end, we'll all just get a last word to come up. And then, in fact, I'll do a last. Katrina will say a last kind of sum up just what she reflected. It's basically, what do you really take away? It's a big takeaway of the conversation, or something you'd like to leave the audience with. Katrina will say a last word or so, and then I'll actually wrap. And again, to think about this is live, but most people watch it after the fact. It's also a podcast, and also we will do shorter pieces of this later on shorter media that'll reach wider audiences. But for
I got one technical concern.
Okay, go ask that.
I'm burning power like crazy. I got 70% charge, and I'm running on battery. Is that enough?
Should be fine. Should be fine.
Sure?
If you had a plug, it'd be nice to plug it in. But
well, I need probably 2 minutes to get the plug out from under the sofa and plug it in there. I've never done it before because I've never needed the charge, but we're really burning power.
I would just let it go right now for now because we're ready to go. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Katrina, any last thoughts did you want to say to the group?
I think you sent out a great memo, Peter. My understanding is that you'll open it and then introduce the participants and then come back to me, and I'll start by framing and throw out the first question, right?
Exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly right. And if, just everyone so you know, is if you click on the box below one of the people's faces, it'll stick on that. And if you unclick on it, it'll flow to whoever's voice is loudest. So generally just let the conversation flow, and that's the best way to see whoever's talking's face goes up. But if you wanted to, you could click on someone to focus on. But for now, just let it flow. And remember, that's not what the audience is seeing. We got a live switch going with David. Okay, David, do you want to put up the logo and get ready to go? And everybody, if you can just...
Here we go.
Be a little quiet here as I introduce it, and then we'll do our little round table. Okay. Welcome to Reinvent and the series Reinvent American Foreign Policy, where this week we're going to be looking hard at the fundamental relationship between the United States and Russia. I'm Peter Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm going to help moderate the discussion a little bit here. Now, it is the mainstream media loves to demonize Russian President Vladimir Putin, and kind of conventional wisdom in Washington sees Russia as an increasingly problematic enemy, you could say. But today at Reinvent, we're going to really step back and kind of look at the bigger picture and really look at the fundamental relationship between Russia and the United States and think through how can we think of them more almost as a potential ally rather than the current way we're kind of framing them. Think of them as a partner in actually, in the coming decades, solving many of the big foreign policy challenges that we're going to face. For example, how are we really going to solve or thwart global terrorism? Or how are we going to stop nuclear proliferation? Or how are we going to ease the tension in the Middle East between the Sunni and Shia if we really don't have a good working relationship with Russia? That's one thing we're going to be thinking about. The other thing we're going to do, as we do here at Reinvent, is we're going to be thinking long term. And so we're looking at a situation in the coming decades where the world seems to be inexorably needing to, and probably doing so more aggressively after Paris here, weaning itself off oil. And so as oil becomes less central to the structural centerpiece of the global economy, how is that going to affect Russia, and how will it affect Russia's foreign policy? Can we look ahead at some, are we going to see more dangerous kind of twists and turns ahead of it, or potentially some real opportunities for deeper collaboration and cooperation? Now, this is to kind of guide us in this situation. We're extremely lucky to have Katrina vanden Heuvel, who is the longtime editor and publisher of The Nation. In fact, I understand it's now about 20 years she's been leading that organization through all the various ups and downs of the last 20 years and all the foreign policy ups and downs. She's a longtime commentator in traditional television, cable television, and now we're glad to have her in online video. She's also writes frequently for all kinds of different newspapers, but she also has a regular weekly web column with the Washington Post. She's authored herself several key books. She's also edited or co-edited several other books. And all through this, she's maintained a deep interest and, in fact, developed a real expertise in Russia and all things Russia. So, again, we are very flattered to have her here today. Now, we're also especially, she's not as publicly known, but Katrina has also played a role here at Reinvent, and she and two other individuals, Guy Saperstein and Daniel Berger, have really supported this series from the beginning, along with our partners, the Plowshares Fund. And so we're very grateful both to her and to all of them as well. So besides having Katrina here for today, we also got a very esteemed group here that's going to be working through this problem here and working on these questions. And what we do here, as we always do in Reinvent, is we go around the table and just have everyone introduce themselves a little bit of what they bring to the table. What is it about their background that would be relevant to the conversation at hand? And so let's start with Susan Eisenhower, who is the president of the Eisenhower Group. Susan, do you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Well, yes, thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I am Chairman Emeritus of the Eisenhower Institute as well, and it was through the Eisenhower Institute that I made my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1986. I've traveled intensively in that part of the world, especially during those tumultuous years, and at one point I served for 3 terms on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Security and Arms Control. I also have written a number of books on Russia and Central Asia, or co-edited books on those subjects, including one on U.S.-Russian cooperation in space called Partners in Space. It's a delight to be here today. These are very serious and important issues, and I look forward to the conversation.
Terrific. We're really happy you're here with us. Next, we have Stephen Cohen, who's the Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies, History, and Politics at both NYU and Princeton University. Stephen, do you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Well, I'm not the most esteemed member of the table, but probably I'm the oldest. And that means that I bring here 50 years of studying Soviet and Russian history and politics. I also bring a deep conviction, which I think I formed in the late 1970s, that there can be no real American national security without a partnership. I did not say friendship, but without a strategic partnership with Moscow. I have warned for more than 15 years that American policy toward post-Soviet Russia was leading to a new Cold War. It doesn't matter because some people don't want to call it a new Cold War, but that the situation we're in today with Russia, from Ukraine and Europe to Syria, is more dangerous than was the preceding Cold War. And making it still worse, and I can't speak to the situation in the UK, but there is almost zero public debate about our policy toward Russia. That's quite unlike, as Susan will certainly remember, because we were involved back in the 70s and 80s. There were two hands clapping then. Now there's only one. And I am deeply, deeply concerned about where things are headed, even though we have here now in the United States something called a presidential campaign. But getting the candidates to engage the topic has been almost impossible.
Well, we hope to kind of help fill that void today, Stephen, and really have a really in-depth, sophisticated conversation about it today, and then spread it in the coming weeks. Next, we have Mary Dejevsky, and she is coming from England. She's the chief editorial writer and columnist at The Independent. Mary, do you want to give us a little bit of your background?
Hello.
Oops. Mary, can you talk? Give us a little of your background. Uh-oh. I think we're losing all across the Atlantic here. Okay. Can you hear us? Can you give us a little of your background, Mary? Can you hear us okay? Okay, I'll tell you what, Katrina, why don't we move it back to Katrina for the little frame as we kind of work on Mary integrated back in better here, okay?
I know that the U.S.-UK relationship is going to revive. This is not a measure of that relationship. Peter, thank you for framing, and thank you, Susan and Steve, for bringing your biographies to the table in such compelling ways. I thought it would be important to begin with a little history. It's going to be 25 years this year since the end of the Soviet Union. And at that time, and for many years after, we were told that the Cold War was over. Yet now, we seem to be back to something akin to a new Cold War with Russia, and one that, as Steve mentioned, stretches from Ukraine to Europe to Syria to Turkey, the Middle East generally. And it's getting worse by the week. As we gather today for this roundtable, however, there are conflicting signals. There are signs that the state of the relationship might be improving at the same time that this relationship is worsening. Take, for example, something your viewers may have followed. Secretary of State Kerry and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have tried to cooperate in restarting negotiations over the Syria crisis, even over the Ukraine crisis. Yet just last week, and Steve mentioned how our media in so many fundamental ways is failing us, just last week, virtually unreported, NATO and Washington announced a quadrupling of spending, quadrupling of the NATO U.S. forces and weapons on or around Russia's borders, something Russia has not experienced since Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. And this decision, and we'll talk about what consequences this might have, may well undermine the negotiations that are already so fragile, negotiations over Syria, and further divide Europe itself and escalate a new and already dangerous U.S.-Russian nuclear arms race, which has been underway, as Susan Eisenhower has written and spoken about, has been underway for several years. So this is certainly the most dangerous conflict of our time, and I hope that one of the topics of our discussion today is what can be done. What are some key recommendations, if there is political wisdom, for moving from hostilities to, as Peter mentioned, some kind of U.S.-Russian partnership, which is so vital, essential to finding political solutions to conflicts racking our world. For example, Russia was essential in the Iran nuclear deal and will be essential in enforcing it. Steve mentioned the missing debate in this country. This roundtable, I trust, will fill in a kind of foreign policy gone AWOL, particularly about U.S.-Russian relations. I can't speak for other countries, but in the U.S., there's almost no real serious public debate about this gravest of international crises. And the mainstream media, and listeners may bring their different definitions of what that means, but inside the Beltway, those publications which have some authority with the political elite, has essentially engaged in what award-winning journalist Robert Perry has called groupthink, a kind of religious adherence to the narrative that Russia, that Putin is solely to blame. Our think tanks, with few exceptions, are not doing a lot of thinking, certainly not rethinking, and essentially supporting the official narrative of Russia that it's to blame, so that it's the aggressor. And our political class has failed to offer even a debate, one worthy of a democracy. So I hope our purpose today is to provide that missing debate, to offer alternative perspectives, fresh insights, and big, bold ideas that go beyond the conventional thinking. I'm proud the nation has participated in these last critical years in challenging that sort of conventional unwisdom, that one-sided narrative. It's been a business of ours for 150 plus years. We just marked 150th anniversary last year. But there are just too few others. So as we talk today, let's think first about what is the fundamental relationship, what can be done, both in these times, these critical times, but also in the long-term strategy, which too few political figures, too few think tanks are even engaging. What is the long-term strategy for U.S.-Russian relations? And finally, as you know, there's a presidential election underway. How do we think the campaigns are addressing this gravest of issues? Are we being offered alternative policies? Usually presidential campaigns are times for a fresh start, to hear some alternative policies. Do we see any shoots or signs of such? And if not, what can we provide? What can we speak to that would inform this presidential campaign, which is just off to a start this month? So let me begin, if I could, though, if Mary is back on board, we could hear from Mary about her role in journalism and studying of Russia over these last years. If not, I'd like to begin with Steve, not because he's my husband, and not because he's a longtime contributor to the nation, but just in the spirit of going alphabetical. So if Mary is not on, Steve, talk a little bit about the fundamental nature of the relationship, the U.S.-Russian relationship. Specifically, how do we move away from the demonization of Putin, which is so rampant in our political class's discussion, mainstream media, and the framing of Russia as the enemy? How do we begin to change that narrative in ways so that Russia emerges more as a partner in solving many of the foreign policy crises that we confront today?
You're certainly right that the narrative is the primary problem. For us here today, the narrative doesn't actually begin with Putin and his rise to the presidency of Russia, but back in the 1990s, when the Clinton administration decided we had won the Cold War. But many people involved in that process point out that Reagan and Gorbachev, for example, announced that the Cold War was over in 1989, 2 years before the end of the Soviet Union. But the Clinton administration embraced this triumphalist narrative, and part of the outcome was a decision, wicked, unwise, and ramifying today, to expand NATO toward Russia's borders. And that expansion goes on. NATO has recently reaffirmed that they intend to bring in Ukraine and Georgia. So how you revise a narrative in the United States where all of the mainstream media, newsprint and broadcast, are down with this narrative, and then write the sequel that Putin's rise to the presidency of Russia has caused all the problems we have today, and go on then to demonize him in words that, I don't know, maybe Susan can remember a precedent. But after Stalin, I don't recall even any Soviet communist leader being described in such vulgar, debased, crass language. And the allegations against him, many are preposterous. Mary wrote a brilliant column pointing out, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that the so-called hearing in London into the Litvinenko death was a kind of travesty of British justice. This great tradition of due process simply was lacking. So how you change the narrative, particularly when in this country, I'm not sure about in the UK, the handful of us who have tried to change the narrative have become Putin apologists and stooges and toadies of the Kremlin. This defamation, first of all, has to be endured, ignored, and we need to keep pushing. But, and this is an empirical fact, you could look it up, most of us have been excluded now, though we participated actively years ago from the mainstream media. We turned to alternative media like The Nation and other places and the internet to get this alternative narrative out. Once we could change the narrative, it would end up like this. A new narrative would be, no, Russia and Putin are not solely and arguably mainly responsible for where we find ourselves today. But even if we agree, but Washington and its media do not agree, that the United States and Russia are each 50% responsible, that's the beginning of a dialogue. That's the beginning of negotiations. But so long as Russia is blamed for everything, from Ukraine to the refugees in Europe to Syria, there's nothing to discuss. So changing that narrative and acknowledging that the United States, London, NATO, considerably helped bring this exceedingly dangerous situation upon us, till we can get people to acknowledge that. Because the moment American officials or journalists or professors, who themselves are deeply complicit, say, okay, yes, we did a few things wrong, that means that we in the United States need to rethink. But as Katrina pointed out, there is absolutely no rethinking of American policy toward Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. And, you know, history is determinative. Until we rethink our history, our own history, which is false, of this relationship today, it's very hard to get to specific issues. Though I think, and I think Kerry has made some effort, that both Syria and Ukraine are fully negotiable. The negotiations are on the table. It's just that the party that does not want a negotiated settlement dominates, and in the White House today.
Actually, Susan, do you want to build on that? And we also are going to introduce a new player into the game here in a second here. If Richard, you can hear us good. But let's first go to Susan, building off of what Stephen just laid out there.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, following up on what Steve says, there is a very different interpretation today, I think, about the nature of Russia as opposed to what existed in the early 90s. It's stunning, the attitudinal change in this country. But there are several other things that have changed at the same time. We're all very conscious of the 24-hour news cycle, and I think that was just beginning in the late 80s. And I think this 24-hour news cycle has brought about a political atmosphere in this country that is highly charged. So what used to be a foreign policy debate, primarily among experts, and then filtered down somewhere to ordinary Americans, today we have a situation where everything is politicized. Foreign policy is politicized, and certainly U.S.-Russian relations are highly politicized. We saw the dawn of this with the Clinton announcement that NATO is going to expand. He chose the opportunity to make that announcement at the Polish-American club in Chicago a couple of months before his re-election campaign. And so that was really the start of, I think, a much more highly charged environment. Secondly, because this 24-hour news cycle, we have mostly, I hate to say this, journalists interviewing journalists. And there is not the same sort of standard to bring experts onto the television. And that's not just on U.S.-Russian relations, it's on any number of other issues. And finally, I would say that there's a generational thing. Probably many of the people participating in this roundtable are a little older than some of the people who are on television today or in politics. And we remember, actually, what tremendous sense of hope there was in the run-up to the end of the Cold War and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. After that, it seemed like almost anything was possible. I think that's one reason it's continually incumbent on us to make the point that at a time when things were very uncertain, people found a pathway forward and engaged in unprecedented cooperation. So I look forward to talking about what the next steps could be here today.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we go back to Katrina here, Susan, this is the beauty of this new medium, is we can pull people in from everywhere in the world. We're bringing someone in right now from England, and we basically want to introduce Richard Sakwa, who's a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent at Canterbury. And Richard, is that where you're coming in from today, right now?
Yes, indeed. I'm in the office at the moment.
That's good, and I think you're going to win the award from the Reinvent crew here for the most impressive bookshelf behind any person we've ever had on 100 or so of these roundtables. I must say that's quite a tribute to you. But we just want to integrate you in. We had a little getting in here, and Katrina, why don't you just set a little context for Richard and get him involved in the conversation as well.
Richard, we've been talking. First, we started with some of the history, which you'll appreciate, about how it is that 25 years ago when the Soviet Union ended, we were told there was no Cold War anymore, but that we are living now through what certainly has the feel, shape, sound, smell of a new Cold War. We were talking about how we hope this roundtable would lead to some long-term ideas about how we improve this U.S.-Russian relationship. Susan rightly reminded us there is a generational component. I mean, there was a time when the relationship was strong and sturdy and collaborative, when you saw the arms control process moving swiftly. Now we're seeing so much of that regressing. And Steve spoke to a question about how do we move away from the demonization of Putin, which has so shaped the narrative in this country, and I suspect the little I read in the UK. How do we reframe, shift that narrative so that there's at least an opening for a debate that I don't see happening in this country, and would welcome hearing from you as to whether what you're seeing a debate there, and on those other questions to hear from you. And glad you linked in.
Yeah, I had to change the browser. Thank you very much. Can I step back a little bit and say that indeed, how do we move forwards? But to move forwards, we do need to get the context of where all this began. The way I see it now is that we've been in 25 years in which we have been locked what I would call a cold peace. Now, this was from 1989 to 2014, and the fundamental question was who won and who lost the Cold War. Obviously, in a certain sense, the Soviet Union and then Russia were losers. Obviously, the country changed, everything was had to be rebuilt from scratch. But the fundamental question was that the end of the Cold War ended up with an asymmetrical new system. It was asymmetrical. And what we've seen for 25 years is that Russia has been locked in a dead end. In a dead end in this sense that there was no strategic space for it to develop. By that, we've had a system which I call nowadays the Greater West. This is the West, which is not only institutions, but the ideology of liberal capitalist democracy, a whole stack of institutions and ideas. This is a Greater West in which Russia simply has had no space to develop as an independent member of this enlarged Western system. It wanted to join it under Yeltsin. Putin in particular in his early years was very keen to join the system, yet there seemed to be no space for it to join a body which was expanding, encompassing a larger, Russia and its allies, but it couldn't do it as an equal. It could join, but it could join what you could call the Old West of the Cold War. It couldn't join this new Greater West, which Russia felt it was going to become a constituent founder member of. It wanted to become Western. It wanted capitalism. It wanted democracy. It wanted global integration. It wanted all these things. But how could it be achieved? And we didn't find this recipe, this mechanism, this framework in which Russia could join as a constituent member of a Greater West, instead of which all the institutions of the Old West continued. That's NATO, that's this sense that the West in some way was privileged in this new community. And in economic, ideological, and political sense, Russia found itself in a dead end. Given that framework, all this came to a head in 2014 with the Ukraine crisis, which was a symptom, not a cause of all of this. How do we go beyond it? Then we simply have to reconceptualize two things. One, this greater Western picture. What sort of community do we want to establish in Russia? And secondly, there is a specifically European component to all of this, and that the European Union in the last few years, instead of actually contributing to this reconstitution of the West as a larger community, with many, obviously after the Second World War, Japan is part of this greater West, other countries are part of this greater West, Russia we've not found the formula to let it in. And therefore, more and more frustration has led to all sorts of pathologies within Russia and indeed in the West, which has got us to this point now where we're all shouting at each other, the coarsening of public discourse, the collapse of traditional diplomacy, the language sometimes used by our Western leaders has been absolutely shocking in the United Nations, elsewhere. So there's a general crisis. Of course, we all externalize it. So the West blames Russia, Russia blames the West. We're in this terrible cycle. But the only way to get out of it is to start reimagining a different possible political future. That's to rethink the West, and that's including the Atlantic community. And at the same time, to think about what sort of European Union we want, and as it were, a greater European body, that is, one from Vladivostok to Lisbon, and indeed all the way to the Pacific.
Richard, you've raised some extraordinarily thought-provoking ideas on a range of issues, and you've also touched on what our talk today is about, which is reimagining the possible future in a way that isn't about coarsening the language, the debate, the ideas. But I wanted to turn to Steve and to Susan to pick up on whichever aspect, several aspects of Richard's important contribution. Steve, do you want to jump in, or?
Katrina, I'll jump in.
Please, Susan, please.
Just by saying that I'd like to reinforce what both of our speakers have said, this coarsening of the dialogue. Steve, I agree with you. It's absolutely unprecedented. I can't think of another time when American political leaders would get up and make personal comments about the Russian leader or the Soviet leader. Back in the old days, they would call them, Chairman Khrushchev, or they always had very formal titles to them. And I can just say that in the case of the Eisenhower administration, this is an administration I know better than some of the others, but the president, Dwight Eisenhower, felt very, very strongly that if you insult people in public, you will never successfully achieve the potential for cooperation. I guess what I would add to this is that part of the reason we're sloppy about this, or if not downright insulting, and frankly it's coming from the other direction now too, is that people have forgotten that there are consequences involved with a failed U.S.-Russian relationship. And the consequences are, let us not forget, and this is why we should all care, is that Russia is the only country on the face of the earth with the capacity to blow us off the map, actually the whole world off the map. So if that doesn't mean that this requires a vigorous and respectful effort to find common ground, I don't know what does.
Susan, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something because you're so right about how often, too often, it's journalists interviewing journalists. In the context of that, what happens is that some important voices are lost. For example, Clinton, former Clinton Secretary of Defense William Perry, as you probably know, just written a memoir, My Life on the Nuclear Brink, in which he warns that we're on the cusp of a new nuclear arms race. This is one of the terrible collateral consequences of the worsening relationship. Yet, do we see much real coverage? That is part of, I think, a kind of degradation and coarsening of the dialogue. Steve, you've thought a lot about this and other issues Richard raised. Do you want to jump in?
Well, both Richard and Susan and you made important points, and I don't want to take too much time. I do want to say that, and I speak as someone who, while university professor, worked and got paid in the mainstream media. I was for many years CBS's news consultant on and off air, and I wrote for mainstream newspapers. But the degradation of the American media, whether it's part of the general degradation of American political culture or something, some disease that afflicts, and I mean the New York Times, the Washington Post, I'm not talking about these borderline hate sites, has just, coarsened is I guess the right word, it's degraded and debased those publications and made the relationship with Russia so much worse. And I don't know what comes first, the media or our potential leaders. I mean, when Mrs. Clinton equates Vladimir Putin with Hitler, which, you know, the Hitler analogy is blasphemy. It's the worst analogy. And then says she should be president and she will deal with Putin, or Putler as she called him once. I mean, something's gone wrong. And even President Obama has said things about Putin that are simply not appropriate for the occupant of the White House. I also want to say, because it's important, that someone recently posted online Susan's grandfather, Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech when he left the presidency. That was the speech where he said we should beware of the military-industrial complex. But he said much more in that speech about wise leadership in international affairs. And the person who posted that bold-faced the things that President Eisenhower said as he was leaving, that just, I mean, I sat there and said, I wish he was president today, because this is a whole different view of the world and how America should behave in it. So we're dealing with something that's happened in the United States in my adult lifetime that probably is larger than Russia. Something has gone wrong here. Now, for what Richard said, I just want to add a footnote and then not a disagreement, because Professor Sakwa, Richard, my pal, knows Russia better than I do, but I want to add an element. It's laughable, but scary, when Putin is blamed for wrecking, as people put it, the post-Cold War security order in Europe. Russia was excluded from that order. He didn't say, okay, fine, expand NATO to our borders, and that'll be our new security order. Russia's pushed back against this from the beginning, and increasingly, when it developed after Yeltsin, the capacity to do so. So Russia has been excluded from the what's called now the post-Cold War. They mean the post-1991, when the Soviet Union disappeared, security system built in Europe. So Richard, who's thought and written about this more in a more sophisticated and knowledgeable way, and people should read not only his remarkable book, Frontline Ukraine, but the articles he's written about how we got ourselves, our great leaders, into this situation. Let me add one thing, that Vice President Biden has a set lecture against Russia that he loves to give, and that is Russia wants a sphere of influence, and that's 19th century, and it can't have one, and it'll never get one. I mean, this is like a sick joke. The United States has expanded its sphere of influence from West Berlin to the Baltics. What is it? Somebody calculated, I don't know how many kilometers. It's certainly the greatest expansion of a sphere of influence in modern times. And Russia, so far as I can tell, doesn't want a sphere of influence. It wants a zone of security on its borders, which means no foreign military bases, which means no NATO on its borders. That seems to me to be a very reasonable, rational position. One thing I want to push Richard away from is what Russia wanted in the 1990s. I know he knows this, but I want our listeners to be mindful that there is no Russia. There are lots of political elites with different points of view in Russia, and a very powerful but not large, no, let me reformulate it, a very influential but not politically powerful wing of the Russian policy intelligentsia, or the policy class, did not want this westernization of Russia, did not want what we call free market capitalism, did not want what we call democracy. They wanted a post-Soviet revival of an older Russian tradition. We can call it Eurasian, we can call it Slavophile, but in policy terms, they thought embedding Russia in globalization and Western security would lead to exactly what it's led to today, these sanctions, that the West eventually would strike at Russia. So this debate in Russia has been going on since, well, 18th century, but been going on since the end of the Soviet Union. And what's happened, and this is vitally important, and by the way, I think Richard's right, Putin did want to join this Western club. But Western policy, and particularly American policy, has greatly empowered the anti-Western elites and lobbies in the Russian political system. And Putin is not an autocrat. Putin is the decider. He's the #1 leader. But he has to deal with quite a few people, and he can't get half of his policies implemented anyway in Russia, but he has to deal with people who have had, since he's been in power 15 years, 16 years, very different views on what Russia should be doing in terms of security. And I personally have heard in Moscow, these people call Putin a weak leader, too soft on the West, a leader who leads from behind. We've heard that because they see him not as an aggressor, but as some guy who's constantly reacting to Western aggression, and too late. And therein lies, I think, the story of Crimea.
Richard, I'd love for you to build off of some of Steve's comments. I would just add one thing as a journalist. I'm not an expert. But what struck me in what Steve said is how journalists today are essentially reducing a very complex country to a simplistic narrative. That Russia has its elites, competing elites, it has its own Tea Party, it has its various media. I submit that on any given day in Moscow, the print press is more lively and diverse than the print press in my own city, New York City. But in any case, Richard, pick up on that if you would, pick up on Steve's whichever strands, and then Susan the same, please.
Yeah, I must say I agree with Stephen, absolutely, 100%. First, the fact that there are powerful factions in Moscow, many of them, in fact, more and more, do indeed condemn Putin for being a weakling, for giving in to the West. At the moment, they're accusing him of betraying, for example, the Donbass insurgents because he's so keen to get back into good favor with the West. So while we demonize him on the one side for being an autocrat, a despot, and so on, and indeed stoking anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, internally, many lobbies consider him, as Steve said, far too weak. And we must bear this into account. All the opinion polls suggest that if it wasn't for Putin or this sort of system, then the alternative, there's plenty of hardliners, much harder liners out there waiting to come in. That's undoubtedly the case. The idea of Russian politics as a monolith is completely false. There's all sorts of ideas. In fact, even at the level of ideas, the debate is quite enormously rich. What I'm arguing is that in many ways, it's not even so much the Atlantic community, even the United States. It's Russia, and this debate is part of a larger pan-European debate. And that's been the second failure. The first one is the breakdown in US-Russian relations, which you've talked about. But there's also this other failure, and that is the European one, quite a spectacular failure, in part dependent on the first. And that's been one of the shocking events of the latest few years, is the fact that the European Union, which we now think about so enormously, that this European Union has been unable to sustain itself as a separate and distinct way of engaging with Russia. So, in a sense, it's a double failure. And the third thing is that, I mean, even though Steve is absolutely right, that in many ways this debate could have taken place within a larger West, if you see. In other words, that these sort of debates, which were enormously powerful at the time of Gorbachev in the late 1980s, this debate about the nature of Russian identity, the way it would fit into the international community, the way it would work with the Atlantic community, all of these debates were in many ways interrupted in the early 1990s at the time of economic collapse, at the time of Kosovo and the Balkan events and so on. All of these things, this debate didn't really continue, didn't come to fulfillment, no answer. And this was all part of this continuing, what I argue, this dead end, this sort of impasse both internally and externally. And now, after 2014, or certainly after Putin came back in 2012, this debate is in full flood about Russian identity. It's not over yet. So, and there's no clear conclusion. Yes, one of the themes is anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, but I actually think that's contingent. So I think Putin, yet again, is above and beyond an advance of public opinion and some of the hardliners, because ultimately there is nowhere else for Russia to go but to become part of the European community of some sort of enlarged sense, and indeed of this Atlantic European US community with China, I might add, because we forget the Chinese element. It's at the moment, I mean, I've just been talking to people from Shanghai, they have a different but compatible vision of global and world order. For many of the Russian elite at the present time, the leadership at the moment are constantly saying that this turn to China, which is in the East, which is in many ways delayed and an essential move, it's not at the expense of Russia as a European economic and political power. So what we now need to do is to find a new mode of reconciliation is essential, of course, but a mode of integration, of finding a way to go forwards. I actually think it's actually, in some ways, it could be easier than we think. I don't know about the United States, but the difficulty at the moment in European Union is that there's far too big a lobby, in particular because the European Union has enlarged to an Eastern European community, which has a whole stack of grievances, political, historical, and so on, against Russia. And instead of overcoming them in joining the European Union, what's actually happened is that they've become amplified within the EU. And this is a development which no one really anticipated. And I think this is the whole dimension, is that European Union debate has suddenly shifted into this language of historical grievances, of which
Richard,
Ukraine is just one element.
I wanted to, if I could, drill down a little on two core issues which are central to this moment of hostilities between the United States and Russia, and then move into a discussion of long-term thinking and strategy, something Susan wrote a very good column about last year, the need for a long-term strategy for the Ukraine situation. But let me just begin. Much of official Washington continues to view Russia's involvement in Syria with great suspicion, even strong hostility. How do you think, and begin with whoever wants to jump in, we should view Russia's role in Syria? Is it essential for resolving the Syrian conflict and defeating ISIS? That's the first part, Syria. The second is, it seemed last month that we were closer to a settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Where are we now? How do we see the essential contours of a political diplomatic settlement? Susan, as I said, wrote a column about the importance of a long-term strategy, especially toward Ukraine, ensuring it's not a failed state. Richard, your book, Frontline Ukraine, has located the origins of the conflict in Ukraine in a quarter century of mistakes. Whoever wants to jump in on those two, because I think those are issues very much at the center of at least the U.S. non-discussion debate. They're at the center of our politics and media, but often in this one-note narrative way. So I turn to the three of you for more dimension, more history, more analysis of where we are on those.
Katrina, if I could just sort of usher in this new discussion by saying that I think part of the difficulty we have in thinking about Russia and Syria, Russia and Ukraine and elsewhere is that and I guess this is a final comment I want to make on the overview we gave, is that we have a tendency to see Russia in our own image. I mean, we filter it through our own logic system. One of the things that I think did most for me intellectually was to begin to travel there intensively and to see a same situation from a completely different perspective. And I think that the key point here is that America is very transactional as a country. I mean, we know this. If you're doing business overseas, it's one of the first things you have to tell any business executive is you have to build relationships. In Russia, relationships are critically important. They are a very prideful, emotional people. And so you have these two very different approaches that I think underscore a lot of the misunderstanding. And then I think it's also fair to say, you know, that Russia's made plenty of mistakes and bear, you know, responsibility for where we are today too. But having said that, we've got to recognize that we have two very different ways of solving problems. So if you look at the Syrian question, I would just say very quickly on that point, are they critical for finding a solution to the civil war there? Absolutely. They certainly showed that they had the influence that won the day on the chemical weapons issue a couple of years ago. And so it's not going to be enough just to rail against this. These new efforts to get everybody on the same page, I think, are critically important.
Steve, do you want to weigh in?
Is Mary back? Is Mary with us? Or she's not getting our audio?
I fear not.
She may well be coming in here shortly.
Okay.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I just want to say that Mary is enormously knowledgeable, and I'm sure has opinions on all of this. So if we can get her in when she's back, it would be great. You know, the situation is so bad. I'm not sure what thread we pull to unravel what I see as. I actually think we're drifting toward nuclear war with Russia in a way that we haven't since the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we need I think Katrina may have mentioned this in the opening, but the decision to quadruple U.S. NATO forces on Russia's borders is such a provocation. And it's absolutely clear what Russia's going to do. It's going to move its heavy equipment there, but it's also going to move its tactical nuclear weapons there. Its doctrine is very clear. If the Russian state is confronted by overwhelming conventional forces, Russia will use its tactical nuclear weapons. We are approaching the Rubicon. And I don't see any, and the new American Secretary of Defense has announced that Russia is the #1 enemy of the United States, above China, above the Islamic State. Russia's #1 enemy. I mean, we're back, but we're back with a generational recklessness of discussion that badly frightens me. And I don't see anybody around who's reining these people in, and certainly not our president. I mean, either like Elvis, he's left the building, or he's behind this. I don't know. But there are two, because we've tried to turn to something more immediate. There's a new Cold War. Call it what you want. I think it's more dangerous than the other one. But the pivot of it today is Ukraine. It's the politics of the Ukrainian confrontation that spread into the Syrian debate here in the United States. For example, people say, well, if we cooperate with Putin in Syria, that will be a blow against the new democratic Kiev and things like this, or there's going to be a deal made. All right. German Chancellor Merkel and French President Hollande, with Putin and with the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, crafted a perfectly reasonable negotiated solution to the Ukrainian crisis called the Minsk Accords. I want to make 2 points about this because they are not reported in the United States. And if you report them, you're called a Kremlin apologist. It is Kiev, not Moscow, that's refusing to implement the conditions of this negotiation. I could go into the details, but they won't pass the constitutional laws to give Donbass some home rule, and they won't talk directly with the rebel leaders, which they're required to do. By tying the sanctions against Russia, as the EU has unwisely done, to a resolution of the Minsk implementation of the Minsk Accords, it's given Kiev, which doesn't want the Minsk Accords, a veto over the negotiation process. So Merkel, Hollande, and to the extent that Obama was behind this, have behaved very unwisely. On Syria, there's a simple question to be decided. And in a way, it's a military question. Katrina and I wrote an editorial called Coalition or Cold War with Russia regarding against the Islamic State. Our argument was, and I think a lot of people in the Pentagon have now come to this, and Kerry appears to have come to this, is you can bomb all you want. We know this from military history. And by the way, the Russian bombing, whether you approve of it or not, has been 1,000-fold more effective against the Islamic State and a lot of other moderate terrorists. Best I can tell, a moderate terrorist does not cut off your head, he puts a bullet in your brain. But the Russian campaign has been extremely effective. The Islamic State in Syria is on the run. It may go to Libya, thanks to Obama and Clinton when they decided to get rid of Gaddafi. That's an additional story. But we have to decide, the United States, Obama has to decide, you have to have ground forces. All right. Russia doesn't want to put any ground forces in combat. We've all got special operation forces there, but nobody wants to put combat forces in there. What are the available combat forces to wipe out the Islamic State, take back and hold the territory it's captured, given the opportunity of the Russian and to some extent the American bombing? So it's not clear exactly who the American and the French are bombing. The only viable force is the Syrian army, period. The Kurds are good. The people that Iran is sending in are good, but the only army with the capacity to do this is the Syrian army, which was crumbling when Putin decided, and he said this, it wasn't deceitful, I am going in to stabilize the Syrian state, keep Assad in power, so we can maintain the Assyrian army as a fighting force. All right. So it comes down to this. If we want a fighting force on the ground that can drive back the Islamic State under the bombing, unless you have an alternative, there's nothing but the Syrian army. That's Russia's position. If you agree with that strategically, then you need a full coalition with Russia because all these planes flying around. I was told the other day, I can't believe it, that the Pentagon still refuses, and this means Obama, to share intelligence with Russia. Now, I think they're getting it anyway through Israel or someplace else. But the point here is the unwillingness to cooperate on a functional level against the Islamic State with Moscow is utter folly unless the United States, and Mrs. Clinton has suggested she might be open to this, is prepared to send in 20 or 30,000 combat troops into Syria, which, I mean, it's going to be the end of the world as we know it. We can't even get out of Afghanistan. So this is the issue. Do you agree with the Russian point of view that we need the Syrian army? If so, you've got to keep Assad in place, and you've got to help that army fight. If you don't agree with that, put your own troops on the ground. Washington, put your troops on the ground.
Richard, I want you to weigh in on any part of this discussion, but your book, Frontline Ukraine, received terrific reviews and was called cool, balanced, well-sourced. I mean, in terms of what, if there was the political will and if there was a belief in diplomacy, something Susan has referred to, I mean, diplomacy's been lost as a great art. What would the contours of a political diplomatic settlement look like?
When it comes to Ukraine, it has to be the Europeans beginning to find the answer to it. So far, we've got three actors in play. It's we obviously the United States is one of the dominant ones, but what we now see is the fact that the European players, as it were, the individual member states of the EU and the EU as a collective body, has to gain a certain amount of autonomy and independence in partnership with the United States, but being able to influence it. We remember back in the 1960s when there was enormous pressure on Harold Wilson, United Kingdom, to join the Vietnam War. He refused, and actually he warned about escalation and so on. Today, we've lost that ability to be part of the West, but as it were, opposition and debate within it. And when it comes to Ukraine, for example, we do know that Victoria Nuland has also done it, and that is to put pressure on the Kiev authorities to fulfill their own obligations within the framework of Minsk. But ultimately, Minsk itself is a rather sterile, dead-end process because it doesn't actually help resolve the fundamental strategic question. And the strategic question is, what sort of Europe do we want to see, and indeed, what sort of global order? And when it comes to Syria, it's not clear what the United States wants, other than to maintain its dominant position and not allow interlocutors to change or to change the nature of that world order. So in other words, what we're seeing today is the widening of the crisis that led us into the breakdown of Russian-US-Western relations. Now this is becoming generalized, and the danger is that this will be generalized to the world as a global level entirely, with the US's pivot to Asia. This is, what was it, building up bases across against China, excluding it, the signing of Trans-Pacific Partnership, which excludes China. It's almost, if you look at it, an almost insane policy. The idea should be to, of course, economically, it's deeply interlinked with the West, but politically, to fail to establish a framework which could manage the shifting balance of global power, of global economic and political power. We know that China is in economic difficulties now, but that's the short term. In the long term, there are fundamental things changing, and the United States in the West seems to have absolutely no strategy. That's on a larger level, specific level in Syria. It's not clear what the United States wants. After Russia started its campaign on the 30th of September, the United States organized the shifting of well over 1,000, we don't know how many, of these TOW anti-tank missiles, which basically blunted the Syrian advance. The Russian strategy was not so much to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. The idea was to, as Steve says, to keep the state together. And obviously Russia has always said they're not defending the individual. They're trying to defend the actual infrastructure of state power. And that's a clear strategy. What the United States wants there, I simply don't know. No one knows, other than to be able to determine the shape of the future, but no one tells us what this future is going to look like. So it's a complete dead end.
Richard, let me pick up on something. No, I'm going to turn to you, Steve. Let me pick up on something, because Richard is taking us in the next direction. He's pointing out that the United States doesn't appear to have a long-term strategy, if any. He's also saying that there are fundamental things changing in the geopolitical arena that we need to pay attention to in the context of this conversation, U.S.-Russian relations. Let me put one framing device out there and ask each of you to speak to how you see some larger trends, what is over the horizon. But I'm interested, the structural shift in the importance of oil to the global economy, whether it opens up opportunities or poses bigger dangers in dealing with Russia for the U.S.-Russian relationship. Steve, you've thought for many years and spoken about the Russian pivot, not the U.S. pivot, Asia pivot, but the Russian pivot to stronger ties with China and what that means in terms of both security and alternative geopolitical arrangements. But please, each of you speak to this longer-term framework.
I know I'm going to get in trouble for disobeying my wife, but I think that Richard has raised a fundamentally important question, and I disagree with him. Let me preface it by saying that what the Obama administration still seems to be up to, though Kerry seems not to agree. He's got his own mini détente with Putin and Lavrov. I think you might agree, Richard, and Mary, if you're there. If you can't learn the lesson of Libya, There's no lesson you can learn. And that's why Mrs. Clinton is unqualified to be President of the United States. She and Obama decided to decapitate the state in Libya, and it's now the second capital of the Islamic State and growing every day. And they're still pursuing this idea that get rid of Assad and all the problems will go away. And Putin has said, and the army will go away, and what are you going to do then? But I want to go to what Richard said about Minsk. I don't agree that it's sterile and a dead end. And that all the rethinking and reconstructing of an international security order that would include Russia, there will be no hope for this unless Minsk or something like it prevails for this reason. It's going to take us back to Putin, too. Minsk keeps Donbass and all of eastern Ukraine in the Ukrainian state. Now, you guys, I don't know, Richard, it always interests me whether you consider yourself a European, because you're a very Europeanized man, and we meet in Europe, or whether you consider yourself, I don't know, what we call a Brit. But the UK went through these issues of home rule. There should be some understanding. We fought a civil war and a lot of other Supreme Court battles in this country over states' rights. Minsk gives Donbass, and it takes decades to work this out, some home rule. And in return, Kiev gets back the control of the Ukrainian-Russian border. The main point, though, is this is not a separatist solution. The American press constantly calls Putin a separatist. He doesn't. He has said repeatedly, nobody reads what Putin says in this country, nobody, except the CIA, and they've been silenced. But Putin has made it clear he wants Donbass and the rebel territories to stay in the sovereign territorial, not Crimea, of course, Ukraine. If that doesn't happen, Richard, I think we're going to end up with 3 or 4 Ukraines. There are lots of pockets of unrest in Ukraine. Those with large Polish minorities, Romanian, with a very right, ugly nationalist, uber-nationalist movement in Western Ukraine. If Donbass goes, either as a frozen conflict or as a separate entity, I think Ukraine may break up. And if that happens, Richard, there won't be any European peace for 100 years, because that'll draw the West and Russia into those new Ukraines which it chooses to support. So I think Minsk must be supported by the White House, and that Kiev must be told, implement it or you're on your own. And we have the power to do that. And I know Poroshenko will be threatened by the right wing if he does it. But, you know, leaders lead. And if he's not a leader, he should go. But it's vital, Richard, not to give up on Minsk, because what is the alternative?
Okay.
Can I
could I very briefly, and then I want to turn to Susan to open the conversation about how she sees some of the long-term bigger changes on the horizon. Yeah. Richard.
Can I just say that I agree with Steve completely, and that I'm sorry I wasn't entirely clear. I do think that Minsk is the only way forward in the short term. In other words, to restore Ukrainian sovereignty to the territory which exists today. What I meant by sterile to say that that's the short term, and indeed even that's very tough. Okay, fair enough. And the United States is essential that it supports the full implementation of Minsk. But what I meant is that this doesn't even begin to solve the larger question of how Ukraine is then integrated into a larger European and Western community. Ukraine and indeed Russia. So that's what I meant by sterile, because it isn't actually, it's a short-term fix, absolutely essential to get this fixed, but then we have to move on to the bigger questions.
Susan, last year you wrote a column which focused more on Ukraine and this strategy for the former Soviet republics, but in it, the idea was we need a long-term strategy. So I'd be grateful if you would talk more broadly about some of the issues where you see the United States needing one as the world changes in fundamental structural ways.
Well, it's really true. We never had the equivalent of a solarium project like they instituted after Stalin died to rethink conceptually the whole issue of U.S.-Soviet relations at that time, and now it would be U.S.-Russian relations today. What we really have, I think, is a society, I would agree with all of our panelists who have emphasized that America doesn't really know what it wants to accomplish. It's not just in Syria. This is the reason our political campaign is so strident and so divisive, is people have very different ideas of where they want to take not only this country but our foreign policy too. I guess if you were looking at this strategically, you'd have to say to yourself a couple of things. First of all, it's not enough to list desirable goals. You've got to match those against your human and your financial resources. You have to find points of leverage to avoid outcomes that are counter to your interests. I don't think we've done any of that kind of thinking. If we did, I think we would certainly be looking at the potential for cooperating with Russia more. So I would just like to say that there are two things that have sort of occurred to me historically that put us in a sort of ahistoric period right now. One is that one of the great objectives during the Cold War was to avoid pushing the Soviet Union and China closer together. You could argue that that was one of the reasons that an opening to China was a major strategic move in the Cold War, not just in bringing China into the international community. And so this is what we're doing right now, which already I find curious from a strategic point of view. Why push anybody in any direction? That's number one. Number two, in the 1990s, and I was so privileged to participate in so many programs related to nuclear cooperation especially. I served on 3 panels with the Department of Energy, and we were helping the Russian Federation secure nuclear materials in places like Snezhinsk and other atomic cities. All of it was predicated on our deep fear that Russia would become a failed economic nation and then would be open to all of the instability and difficulties experienced by countries that don't have proper leadership or a proper institutional structure. And economic failure was very much on our mind as we were putting together programs to keep Russian scientists from emigrating to countries of concern. So it seems curious to me today that there are people talking about broadening sanctions on Russia at a time when oil prices, just to get to your point about oil prices are dropping. The news economically out of Russia is not good, but for some reason this seems to bring a smile to certain political faces. I think we really need to sit down and have maybe we should start a new solarium project for today to talk about what the consequences would be if Russia gets pushed too far on a range of issues. And I think that certainly the oil situation is going to hasten what may have already been started with a shrinkage of the economy through sanctions.
Say, terrific, Susan. Thanks a little bit. I just wanted to introduce quickly here. I think we actually have Mary Jajewski coming in from England, also from a columnist, editorial writer, columnist with The Independent. Can you hear us? Okay. Can you give us are you in?
Yes, I can finally hear you beautifully. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you well. So, Katrina, do you want to just maybe get Mary's perspective integrated in here with the time we have her? Oops, you're muted there, Katrina.
Mary, we've talked quite a bit. We've missed your voice. But I do want to get your sense. We've been talking about the Western-Russian relationship and how it has worsened in ways you've followed over these last decades journalistically and in other ways. Part of this roundtable is how can we transform the relationship into one more of partnership and not of hostility? And the demonization of Putin in Russia is so rampant in our media, the framing of Russia as the enemy. How do you see addressing that? How do you see, as a journalist, as a longtime thinker about U.S. Western-Russian relations, how do you see tackling that, and how fundamental is it in the need to transform before we can move?
Well, I think one of the absolute priorities, which has been done almost not at all, is actually to listen to what Putin and the people around him are saying. Very often, I hear people say, we don't understand the huge inconsistency in what Putin or Russia is doing. But actually, there isn't nearly so much inconsistency as it's simply that people are not listening to what Russia is saying. And I think that's a huge change that we have to make. I think that I just heard Syria and Ukraine. And I would like to say one specific thing about that. I think that the United States and Europe should do absolutely nothing to the boat currently in Ukraine, because it seems to me that for all the denigration of Minsk II, that agreement is actually holding. And that when people accuse Russia of trying to use Syria as a distraction from what it may be doing in Ukraine, I see it slightly differently. I mean, I think that if Syria is a distraction, it's a distraction for Russia and for Putin from a really quite the Russians, and Putin in particular, to get out of Ukraine, to keep Crimea, but to leave Ukraine as a sovereign state under Kiev. I don't think that expansionist aims for Ukraine. And I think if we allow ourselves to be distracted by Syria, this will allow to quieten down about Ukraine and actually leave Ukraine without appearing to lose face. And I think this is very important.
Would anyone like to jump in on that? Richard, Steve, Susan?
I mean, yes, indeed. I think that a sovereign Ukraine, I mean, the question is ultimately also what happens about Crimea. That's one element. But a big actor in this, I go back to it over and over again, is whether the European Union can actually contribute to the solution. Yes, we have Hollande and Merkel, the heads of France and Germany, who are the key players in Minsk. The United States is not a member of that process. But the big question, the one which you are suggesting, is that ultimately, given the fact that the crisis which has begun since 2014, of which Ukraine is a symptom, that's why Minsk, I said, is an essential part of the solution to that local issue, but ultimately it's not the beginning of a solution to the larger question, and that is the security of Europe, and indeed what sort of vision of a cooperative global order can we begin to start moving towards. And to achieve that, we've got to start thinking some of the big questions, and one of them is the relationship between the level of values, because a lot of people say, in a sense, that we can't talk to Russia, we can't talk to China because they have different values, that in some ways how can we talk to authoritarians in this whole language, which I think is a complete dead end, because it assumes, first of all, that we know all the answers. Second, that the solutions that we in the West have found to the question of human community and all the rest is applicable at all times to all other countries in all manner. And that's just simply an impossible claim, but it is the claim at the very heart of what the Western, or certainly the Atlantic community, is asserting. And Russia certainly could never accept that. It isn't just Putin, it isn't just Yeltsin, it's the whole political class, and indeed it's a cultural intelligentsia. But they are divided, but nevertheless, so are we. And in other words, that we must be aware not to become hermetic, that is to close ourselves off entirely, but to be open to different ideas and different forms of social political community? That's the big question. And I'm afraid today that given the level of public debate, certainly the US presidential election, it's actually quite frightening looking at it from over here. But one has to say that given Bernie Sanders' huge success, nearly pipping Clinton at the post in Iowa, and the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is the leader of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, it's a sign that the people, the demos, if you like, are beginning to fight back and are beginning to have their voices heard.
Richard, you lead directly into what might be our concluding section. We have about 10 minutes. But we talked about some fundamental transformations that need to happen to shift the U.S.-Russian relationship from one of Cold War and hostility to partnership, a little bit about long-term strategy. But let's bring it to this moment. As you said, Richard, we are in a presidential election season in this country. How would, and this is to all of you, how would you like to see, if not the candidates, but think tanks, the media, what are the steps, the suggestions you have for opening up in the short term toward longer term change? To end, how do we end the missing debate, the one-note narrative that has so defined whatever passes for discussion around this major important issue?
I should jump in because I may lose power soon.
Steve, you might want to mention the American Committee on East-West Accord, because I thought Susan, in mentioning the new Solarium project, grounded it. I mean, I think people seek projects, what they can do if they care about this.
I may be losing power, so I should go to the main issue that was raised and then we got away from it. Looking over the hill, as you say, what's the alternative? As I said when we each introduced ourselves, I'm not the most distinguished member of the panel, but I probably am the oldest. And maybe that's why I gravitate in my Medicaid years. And by the way, all the Democratic presidential candidates, and Vice President Biden too, because he may jump in, are on Medicare. That means you're over 65 and in the 70s. Interesting development. But I gravitate toward Kissinger at this moment, who at 92 is on the march again for his vision of a world that goes back centuries, his concept of a balance of powers and not a unipolar world. So everybody knows we had a bipolar world when the Soviet Union existed. When it ceased to exist, Washington has pushed hard for a unipolar world, that is to say, an American-dominated world. When Richard says that Washington doesn't know what it wants, you know, somebody said that. I don't think that's correct. I think the single most powerful foreign policy force in Washington, which is fully bipartisan, its representatives are everywhere in the Obama administration too, is what people call neocon or liberal interventionists. This is what they want. They want a world that looks like the United States. It's a kind of colonial view. The reality is that that moment has passed. This is what makes the moment so dangerous. People in Washington, maybe our president himself, I'm not sure, but certainly almost all of the would-be presidents on the scene today want a unipolar world where Washington is either the policeman or the manager or the decider. It's impossible. Their own globalization destroyed this possibility. Economic centers of power are emerging from China. Moscow will get back on its feet. To the BRICS, it can't be. But when a great power pursues with the force of arms an illusion, it becomes exceedingly dangerous. So I think that probably our best hope at the moment is to first try to persuade Washington to knock this off. They can't be the superpower anymore. America hasn't held the heavyweight boxing championship of the world for decades. That was always the marker that we were the superpower. It's now former Soviet boxers or somebody, Klitschko or somebody. We've got to persuade Washington that this isn't viable and it's dangerous. Secondly, we've got to let the evolution that's underway of alternative centers of power and influence take their natural course of development because we can't stop them. In this sense, economics is a determinant. not in the sense that Marx meant, but in the sense that these ideologists of globalization meant. So to me, that's the safest course, the safest orientation, at least for us here in America. I don't want to be mean to Richard or Mary to the extent that they consider themselves Europeans, but the Europeans have behaved so badly during this whole crisis. Going back to November 2013, when they tried to impose on Yanukovych a preposterous association agreement, which triggered this. It wasn't the sole cause of it, but triggered it. And Merkel's unwillingness to man up, if you'll excuse the expression, and just impose her darn Minsk Accords. Now she's attacking Russia today for Syria because she's frightened and she's losing her standing in Europe, whatever. But what's lacking at this moment is leadership. And then to answer the final question, do we see leadership somewhere out there in this presidential campaign? And I leave you with this Zagadka, this riddle. The only person who's forcefully stated an alternative policy toward Russia in his own crude way is Donald Trump. When he says he doesn't accept these allegations against Putin because they've never been proven, that's the correct thing to say. And when he says he will make a deal with Putin, he means, because he doesn't quite understand it, he means diplomacy. So Trump, God help us, has come forward with an adumbration, at least, of a new way of thinking about American policy toward Russia. I'm not going to vote for him, but you're asking what's out there. It's a wasteland, and maybe that's why Trump towers, because it's a wasteland. Sanders is edging toward that position, but he seems not to be able or ready to assert it forcefully. But, this train has left the station, and I don't think, Richard, I guess it was one of your compatriots who said we're all dead in the long run. The short run is really dangerous.
So
really
let me set the record straight that a wife often doesn't agree with her husband, and open it up for Mary. You have not been part of the conversation in the ways we had hoped, but your few words have brought you in powerfully. Would you like to speak to this moment, what might be done? Respond to Steve.
Yes, I mean, I think that there are opportunities, not right now maybe, but I think that Russia is almost desperately reaching out to engage, to find people to talk to, and it almost doesn't understand how. I received today, and there was a meeting in London about the report on the last Valdai meeting in October. And the way that has been edited is like a gigantic, extensive cry for help of having some sort of more collegiate system, both for the economy and for security. And one of the things that they're talking about is that maybe the G20 should become a much more important and significant forum for discussing all these geopolitical and economic issues. And it just seems to me that they are, that maybe Putin, maybe some of the people around him are trying to find people they can do business with, and so far they haven't found them. I agree absolutely with the criticism of the European stance towards Yanukovych and the association agreement. I think they did not understand the significance of this for Russia. A year later, after the war in Ukraine had started, the European Union then offered what should have been on offer before, which was to discuss with Russia, not to give Russia a veto, but to discuss with Russia and to talk about the Eurasian Economic Union as well. That was all Russia was asking for. It was vetoed by Europe the year before, and if it hadn't been, then we might be somewhere quite different. I think also I heard distant sounds, people talking about maybe arms control, and although it's one of these old hoary subjects, if in doubt, if things with Russia are dreadful, go back to the arms control topic. But what Putin has repeatedly alluded to are the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, but also the abrogation of the ABM Treaty and Star Wars. And Russia is still preoccupied by those things, and I think maybe there could be room for discussion under a new president.
Mary, thank you for reminding us that we need to modernize our thinking, not our nuclear arsenal. We are closing in and on the end of this very good conversation. I wanted to turn to either Susan or Richard, either a takeaway you want to leave us with after our conversation, or to pick up on what others have said in these last few minutes. Susan, Richard?
I think Susan.
Susan, please. Susan, will you jump in? Susan, would you jump in? Or
Susan, you have to unmute. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. I'll just jump in here because Richard has been so articulate. I'd love to give him the last word here. I just have a couple of short things. You know, we could talk about the long-term horizon. I believe deeply in finding avenues of cooperation. We used them during the Cold War to make sure that things did not become destabilized to a dangerous point. So I think we need to all be working towards that. But in the meantime, we have a presidential election. And I would really urge our candidates to first do no harm. I think the American electorate would find it refreshing if they would simply say that this is an extremely complicated situation, but if I'm elected president, I will appoint a special envoy who has deep experience and trusted relations in Russia, so that that some of these avenues can be explored more thoroughly. And finally, I just have to go back to the generational thing. Yes, Donald Trump certainly offered a completely different take on how to deal with Russia. But, you know, in a way, so did Rand Paul. And Rand Paul's a young guy. I don't say that as a person who, you know, is working on his campaign, quite the contrary. But I think that there are changes that are happening with younger people. And we should not take our eye off that ball. We lost a generation here, but it's up to all of us, I think, to begin to try and build a new cadre of young people who know about international security, who know about bilateral security, who are interested in cooperation economically, culturally, scientifically, and in every other way.
Thank you, Susan. Richard, will you...
I do think that we are, at the moment, dancing on the edge of the volcano. This is more dangerous than it was even at the Cold War. This is the fourth great crisis since the Second World War. Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Able Archer in late 1983. This one, because we don't know the rules of the game. We don't know the limits. What slightly, though, does cheer me is that the fact that we're beginning to understand that we are on the edge is perhaps the first moment, the beginning of understanding of that we have to do something. It's awful to talk about it, but last week on BBC Two, there was a television program called The Third World War, and it was running through the scenarios of how no one wanted war, but how we could escalate into a nuclear exchange over Latvia. But it was, everybody said how awful this was, but actually it was the sense that even the establishment in the UK and elsewhere is beginning to understand the danger. On the other side, perhaps we can begin to see that this is still part of the endless European civil war, which has been continuing for over 100 years. And it seems ridiculous when you begin to look at it, the world from the Chinese perspective, the Pakistani perspective, from elsewhere in the world. There's massive shifts going on. For example, even in Pakistan, if you go there now, highways are being built, railways, deep water ports, all by Chinese capital. Elsewhere, the power, economic power is shifting. We may not like it, but actually it's also accompanied by a vision of global order. We talk about the return of great power politics. The Chinese are absolutely explicit, opposed to any concept of a concert of powers or that sort of way forwards. So in other words, the salvation may indeed lie in the East. It's paradoxical because the West really has made rather a hash of things since the end of the Cold War.
I want to thank all of the participants this afternoon for doing what this series is supposed to be about, which is bringing history to bear, which is bringing intelligent, alternative, fundamentally transformative ideas into this conversation. And most important, in the United States where there, as I said at the beginning, there has been a missing debate, no debate. I think today we took the first step on reviving the tradition of serious debate and discussion about one of the gravest international crises of our time, and in doing so, a service, if I could say, to our fragile democracy. And thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter to close it out. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. This has really lived up to the high standards of this entire series. And for those, there's been a lot of themes here that have come up. We actually did one on the reinventing the nuclear arsenal just last week. We did one on the millennial generation's foreign policy. And many of the themes that came through have been coming consistently through this series. So thanks again for pushing the envelope and really our thinking on Russia. And we hope to have many of you back in the future days. So thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.